Hello, everybody. I'm Chantal Spencer. This recording is a little strange because I forgot to press record on the day, so I'm having to record the first two slides on a separate occasion. But yeah, hopefully that will still work fine. So yeah, I'm Chantal Spencer and I'm a disabled feminist academic working in the fields of sustainable design through design justice, disability justice and mobility justice. I consider myself to be a maker, a designer and a disability rights activist. So my current research explores legacies of oppression that exist within traditional participatory design and research methodologies. It aims to move beyond prevailing ideologies of inclusivity, particularly those formulated by individuals in positions of power. I also consider how the disability justice call to arms, nothing about us without us, has been commodified by masculinist, Eurocentric, neoliberal, capitalist culture so that it may fit more cohesively into what Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins refers to as the matrix of domination. Through my research, I aim to develop a significant shift in thinking around the philosophy of inclusive practices and instead create a framework that actively dismantles these hidden systemic oppressions. This image is a key, this image is of a commissioned piece of work that I did for Brighton and Hove City Council. And it is a piece of work that describes my world from my mobility scooter. But it's really much more than just a geographical map. It's really about all the kind of frictions and freedoms of movement that I experience as a disabled woman, moving about my city. And the reason why I show this is that really a key component to my work is me and my lived experience as a disabled woman navigating the world. My qualitative research often begins with my own life and my own stories. And really mobilities and moving and the frictions and freedoms of movement are really central to that work. So here, this is an image of me out and about on my mobility scooter. It was taken at a place called Up and Over or High and Over in Sussex. And it is part of a series of visits and blogs that I wrote a couple of years back when I was first discovered when I first got my mobility scooter. And I was determined to find accessible green spaces, which there were very few of, and they were very difficult to find. But yeah, I love this image. So these frictions and freedoms of movement that I was just talking about can be referred to as immobilities. So immobilities is not just about no movement or stopping of all movement, but about the restrictions of movement or forced movement, whether that is felt or experienced. Mobility justice principles assert that while freedom of movement is often perceived as just a general kind of fundamental human right, it's in fact dictated by intersecting axes of oppression and or privilege that shape a person's physical, emotional, social and cultural political mobilities. So I'm really interested in how, moving through spaces, and that might be physical spaces, but that might also be emotional spaces, and what those mean. For example, if I get a taxi, Access for Work pay for me to get a taxi to teach in London, and that movement from the ability to move from my house to LCC in London is much more is much larger just than that physical ability to move. It impacts my life in many ways. So for me, I feel that mobilities is this really exciting space where you not only have this kind of way of seeing and understanding the experience of oppression through the different varying kind of restrictions or privileges that you can have through moving through the world, not just physically, but also culturally. But for me, also mobilities feels like this really pragmatic space where you can enact really tangible change. So that's why I'm kind of mixing in design and mobilities into my kind of PhD. Another sort of central part of my thinking is around the labour of participation. That's how I call it. So this really stems from this idea of crypt temporalities. This is a sofa that was displayed at the Crypt Temporalities exhibition in Frankfurt, and I can't remember the year. 2021. I just love it. It was hard to get here, rest if you agree. So as a person who has chronic fatigue and pain and varying mobilities, it's always hard to get everywhere, and I always need to rest, and I always agree. So crypt temporalities is described here, defined here on the side. The ways in which bodily and mental disabilities shape the experience of time. These include needing to use time-consuming adaptive technologies like screen readers, working slowly during pain flare-ups, or only being to look at a screen for short periods of time. So, although that is definitely part of the description for me, but I feel like my work kind of goes further or to the side or adds to this, in that I'm really interested in the idea of how much time it takes to prepare for things, how much time we take away from our lives and our mobilities and our energies to prepare to go to things, not just in the doing, but in the before, in the after, in how we store all of these memories and these experiences, because even good experiences take energy and take away from us. So I'm really interested in this kind of process of that and the recovery after events. Like, for example, if somebody asked me to go out for a coffee for 2 hours, that for me would be, maybe an afternoon and that evening, and possibly at some time into the next day. Whereas, because it would require me preparing to go there, whereas for an able-bodied person, perhaps it would just be 2 hours coffee. So that's part of my research. Another focus of my work is on systemic design and systemic thinking. And people often think of design as objects, and in particular, when I tell people I'm a designer that specializes in disabled mobilities, their minds go straight to wheelchair ramps, like stuff like that. But for me, and in essence, design encompasses so much more than just the physical world. So everything is designed, our education system, our employment system, even our kind of global economy is designed. So for me, I choose to work within these kind of systemic design areas, spaces, to explore these kind of hidden, invisible networks and these architectures of our society, because I feel that that's really where a lot of the kind of hidden and underlying biases and oppressions and problems permeate and exist and stem from. So I've just published a paper with the Systemic Design Association, and it's on the Padlet right now, if you guys wanted to have a look at it. Hang on a minute, done something strange. It is the version online is not the correct one. The one that we've got on the Padlet is the correct one, so look at that one. And it is around ontological perspectives on the labour of change making, and it focuses the human experience of systemic injustices, rather than often in systemic design, people are often talking about larger systems, and I'm coming to it from a kind of ontological perspective. I have no idea how much time I've used. 2 minutes to go. Excellent. I'm on time. Go and slow down. Okay. I'm also working on a second paper that I'm going to be presenting in Leeds at the Leeds Disability Studies Conference in September. So the paper is a kind of follow-on from that, where it talks about the concept of lived experience of disability in the workplace as a universal solution for inclusive practice, and it really critiques that. And actually that within the context of participatory research methodologies, and is kind of largely based on my findings from one of the roundtable events that I ran for my PhD research this year. So they're both called pressure points in the system, and it's really about kind of where systemic failures happen and how often those are most can often be placed on the people that are least able to manage those pressure points and in the system. So yeah, this was a couple of things that I stitched in a kind of part of a creative evening, thinking about actually it was a drawing that someone did for me when I was explaining my ideas, and on the right hand there you see these beads, and the little beads are all kind of facing in, and they're all kind of giving all of their energy and everything to the big bead in the middle. Yeah. So for me that's kind of like participants, and the participants are all kind of feeding in, and the person in the middle is getting their PhD and kind of moving on with their lives and going up and up and up, and they're all just kind of following. And for me, what I really want is this idea of like that actually, you know, somehow through different ways of decoding these flows of labour and understanding the flows of labour and understanding how we can rebalance those out, so that in effect it's not just the researcher that's beneficiary to this kind of to the research, and then the people that are participants are some far away, you know, getting some kind of benefit eventually. Although I understand that it's not going to be necessarily possible in every situation for every research project. It's this kind of philosophy that I really want to kind of build on and work towards, because it's something that I always say, that at the moment that kind of, you know, bottom-up designing is really how people see inclusive practice and how we do it. But for me, bottom-up designing still just leaves us at the bottom. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Hi, I'm Abby Chapman. I'm think tank founder and director of Accessify. I'm also a disability researcher, advocate, and nationwide public speaker on disability lived experience. Today I'm going to speak a bit about policy design and sort of how we address the gaps of inequality in disability. But first, as we're responding, sometimes I find it really difficult to sort of respond from blank. So I have just put some cues. It's completely up to you. You can still go off your own imagination if you want. But maybe what disability means to you, what's your experience with accessibility barriers been, and what's your initial reaction to disability policy as I talk you through it. So I'm going to get straight into it and speak about the National Disability Strategy, which was the first piece of strategy ever created by the government, which was a commitment and a promise to improve disability living and lived experience. It was 8 points, essentially, that was a strategic path forward, which was to improve perceptions of disability, develop more accessible homes, improve the accessibility of public transport, improve employment gaps and education standards, create more consumer choice, widening access to arts, culture, sports, green environment, and ensuring public services are accessible. But did it work? The caveat is the policy is only 3 years old, and that's not a long time for policy, but we should be able to see some change, such as governmental advice or guidelines to put into place. I could speak all day on just one of them, so I'm going to go quite quickly over just 4. I appreciate I'm about to chuck a load of statistics at you. I'm going to upload my presentation to Padlet for those who need time to take it in. So attitudes, perceptions and behaviours. So in 2022, Scope released the Disability Attitudes Report and found that 1 in 3 state that they often have negative attitudes just in the last 12 months. That goes up to 1 in 2 under the age of 55, which correlates with sort of public perception of disability. The older we are, society is more accepting of disability, as it is a sort of automatic given right that as you get older you will become disabled. When it came to housing, before the strategy, the English Housing Survey found that 91% of houses were inaccessible for disabled people to just visit, let alone live in. 2 years later, last year, there was still 0 government guidance on housing, at the same time as having 400 wheelchair users living in unsuitable housing. To clarify, 93% of people with disability don't use a wheelchair, so the numbers are much bigger than this. and 20,000 wheelchair users were on the social housing list. Transport's a little bit more of a complicated one, because if we live in the UK, I think we can probably all accept that transport is inaccessible regardless of disability. But where accessible issues are for everyone, they are heightened for people with disability. So in 2023, the gap stood at 38%, and some quite scary statistics came out of research done by Motability. The one that sticks out most to me is that disabled people are 5 times more likely to be injured whilst travelling than non-disabled persons, and 30% have reduced their independence because of public transport accessibility. The final one that I looked at, which sort of had to be inevitable, was public service and the NHS. So in 2023, 76% of people were unsatisfied with the NHS, 87% with the social care service. We could analyse this, but I think it's quite easy to just say that it's not good enough. As NHS has become more inaccessible, waiting time for diagnostics, treatment going up. The main area that is becoming overwhelmed is A&E. So in 2010, 4-hour waits were introduced as standard. 10 years later, we are waiting usually more than 12 hours. We sort of see it in the first quarter 10 years ago, 150 patients waited over 12 hours. This year it was 150,000. Since 2011, there's also been a rise in admissions to A&E at the same time as 1% fall in general and acute beds, which sort of shows that there's a 32% gap in provision. And again, there's been no real plan to address NHS and social care accessibility and satisfaction. So I guess, what does this all mean? Disability policy is often a lot of talk and very little action, regardless of political persuasion. I have been watching a lot of the general election. I've read every manifesto. Disability policy is not at the heart of any political party. But I want to take a step away from statistics and look at a case study. So person A was born very, very healthy, but by the time they were 15, they had a lot of medical issues. Sort of started at the age of 8. They experienced lower limb paralysis, ended up in a wheelchair. After lots and lots of tests, were told that it was psychological. Again, they'd have a simple break that would then later at 15 being told that the leg needed to be amputated. This person had privilege, and their parents paid out for extensive rehab with success. They'd be diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder. And they'd be relatively okay until they were 21, where the individual became seriously unwell and their heart started to fail. Midway through that year, so it was 2017, the individual was told they'd have a cardiac arrest, and there was nothing they could do. In December, they would have that cardiac arrest. They'd miraculously survive and still haven't yet to get an answer of why that is. A few years later, their diagnosis list is very, very long, under 6 different hospitals, 10 different specialities, 30 tablets a day. But despite their medical circumstances, their disability didn't cause a poor quality of life. The reason this was privilege. They had a support system, they had access to finance, education, employment, and they were okay, they could live with outside of their disability. Now I know that this person is relatively okay and this person has got a good life. This person A is me, and this is what drives me more than any of the statistics. It's my own lived experience with disability. And what I've learned is that we need to think differently about policy and differently about disability. We need to imagine a world where disability is not an automatic factor for poor quality of life. We need think tanks that are apolitical and able to think independently and think critically without bias, that are multidisciplinary, but most importantly involve people with lived experience, and that they don't just think but do. Which is why through my own work I have been working towards this. So 2 years ago I finished my Masters in Design for Social Innovation, and I actually launched the Accessibility Project, which was much more about community health. This year I've been working with a university in London to redevelop and launch Accessify, the think tank for accessible living. We have one aim, which is to work towards a world where disability is not an automatic factor for poor quality of life. So we sit outside of the medical box and the medical model of disability. We do it through two streams. We have projects and service. So our project is where we undertake research in accessibility, disability and community health. We will write the white paper, we will write the policy, but what we do is we take the innovations and the implementations suggested in that paper and we implement them straight into the community to make a positive impact. Our second stream is service. We do a lot of consultancy. We provide a lot of accessibility audits which actually sit outside of our competition in terms of we don't just focus on the built environment, we focus on the social environment and help them create a well-rounded, accessible organisation. We work with schools as young as nursery all the way up to master's level training about how to enable an accessible society. I'm not going to go through all of this, but we are very, very well connected. Especially we are now based in Surrey with plans to expand to London and Sussex by 2025. But we believe in a holistic approach of all working together, which means we do all sit in meetings with the council, with the NHS, to the religious houses and the third sector, and actually just individuals who are interested. But we can't do it alone, and we need to do it together. So part of this is also asking for you guys to get involved if you want to. And there are 4 different ways to do this. You can join our management board, volunteer for projects, become a researcher, or join our community. The last one is quite simple. It's just sort of signing up to our community base. It is free at current. We are developing a membership programme where you will have to pay from autumn 2024. But this will get you exclusive access to our research, seminars, conferences and beyond. I'll put a QR code at the end which will take you to a form which will tell you a little bit more about those roles as an expression of interest, or you can just email us or contact us on Instagram. Like I said, I know I've just chucked a load of information at you, so I will share this on Padlet soon. Thank you.
My name is Sadie Rockcliffe. I am a PhD researcher at the University of Brighton. I am also in my first year, and my research stems on accessibility within blue spaces, in particular looking at the significance this can have to help for societal transformation. I'm going to be looking at, in particular, I'm going to be sharing sort of the research process, focusing on people with visual impairments and their lived experiences engaging with blue spaces. I hope with this research that we can really get down to the significance of lived experiences and telling disabled stories, which is, as we've already heard, absolutely crucial for research findings and implementing policy. So what is my research about? As you may know, in recent years there's been a huge growing interest in the relationship between blue spaces, and by blue spaces I mean aquatic environment, oceans, rivers, lakes, and human well-being. Recognised not only now as recreational areas, blue spaces are also significant therapeutic landscapes for both your spiritual, your physical and your mental rejuvenation. Most importantly now, it's widely socially prescribed as a way for people to deal with everyday life tasks, and people are swimming and taking to blue spaces to be able to get through the day. However, there remains a huge critical gap in understanding the experiences of marginalised voices, and particularly for me it's people with visual impairments. This is actually critical at the moment as well. Lots of research has started to indicate that people with a visual impairment or blindness are at greater than average risk of not being able to access adequate recreation and exercise facilities, experience very heavy social isolation, or rely disproportionately on their relatives to be able to engage with many leisure facilities. So hopefully, by being able to increase accessibility of blue spaces, we can really look, as I mentioned, about societal transformation by increasing not only social inclusion, but also improving place attachments, and with that, environmental stewardship and custodianship. So with this, my research hopes to really delve into the nuanced experiences of individuals with visual impairments in relation to blue spaces. What I want to do is be able to open up new avenues of understanding ourselves in relation to non-human nature, so we can better engage with a full maze of embodied human diversity that shapes our responses to non-human nature and from non-human nature. So my research seeks to address this critical research gap. And with particular focus on outdoor swimming. So outdoor swimming is very seen as currently displays very normative qualities around social class, around race, and around ableness. So with this research, we really need to increase that breadth and inclusivity of engaging with blue spaces as a social practice. And we really seriously need to expand on the limited blue space research that focuses and tells disabled stories. So this research is very timely at the moment. Firstly, we need to obviously look at the significant lack of research that discusses and focuses on the lived experiences of individuals with visual impairment. There's some researchers doing some wonderful things on green spaces or nature connectedness. So we really want to look at outdoor swimming and how visual impaired people have experiences with that. And we also want to increase this research that comes specifically after COVID, where we have seen existing mental health conditions really exasperated. This research actually came from two areas. There was a symposium that went on, and a professional outdoor swimmer who was completely blind came and gave her experiences about accessing the ocean as opposed to environments like the lakes and rivers or canals, where potentially the landscape doesn't change so much. Oceans and coastlines dramatically change due to environmental degradation, due to changes to climate change, extreme weather, and the real difficulties in being able to access that space when these environments are constantly changing. It was very emotional, and there's also a Facebook group which I recommend if you're able to join, and you're free. It offers the ability to be able to link up with people with a vision impairment who want to go swimming. And more often than not, a lot of these as well started with "I hate to ask but" within the post, which just blew my mind, because that's literally what the group had been set up to be able to do. It was there for like-minded people to be able to support each other to be able to go swimming. So it's really about being able to understand lived experiences, being able to work to have this interdependence rather than focusing on independence. See, I caution against this notion of prescribed healthy dose of nature. I love nature, I get out as much as possible, but it does place undue responsibility on individuals and overlook structural inequalities in access. Not everyone can obviously easily access blue spaces, despite the benefits. Simply telling people to go out and get some engagement with water doesn't solve the problem. Many natural-based settings, as well as man-made structures, are heavily embedded with ableism, making them inaccessible to individuals with disabilities, as Chantal mentioned with green spaces. It may be in the form of man-made structures like directional signs. It could be the accessible transport, and it could be pathways and safety updates. In particular, here I've got some signs here, lots of signs that don't include braille. There's no point having these big flags that say no swimming if actually people can't see them, and they just generally would go in that particular area swimming or engaging in the blue space anyway. The thing is, we don't know a lot about the lived experiences of people with visual impairments accessing the sea. There's not enough research out there, so we really need to start doing more research to being able to get a better understanding of lived experiences, and in particular lived experiences for well-being as well. Well-being should be seen as a emergent quality of shifting relationships involving both human and non-human elements. So we need to advocate for a positive identity politics that recognises the diversity of disability. We want to counter the de-evaluation of disability as a damage, obviously, and look at this plurality of non-human nature experiences. So when you're conducting research like this, it's heavily interdisciplinary. We focus on, we've got the social sciences and sports sciences. It's very particular to consider new materialism and how different structures are going to affect lived experiences with your surroundings. And we need to focus on the different areas of health sciences, human geography, and critical disability studies. Now I've thrown this little one in here. Obviously, please feel free to read it all, but I think it's super important to be able to see the diverse ways that people are, essentially. And these change continuously during different life stages, during different space and time that you might occupy it as well. So it really needs to be taken into account that, of course, you can get these lived experiences. They're going to change individually by everybody and by the same person throughout their life. So it's super important to be able to think about things like that when you're conducting research, gaining the lived experiences of people. And it brings about the question of how do you co-develop? How can you co-create effectively where you're not going to have one agent who's going to benefit more than others? And creative outputs can make a big difference depending on who then gets that output, who can then have these exhibitions and things. But even to be able to, from the very start, to simply ask what questions to ask. For this particular study, we're going to begin with focus groups with relevant stakeholders who are visually impaired as well and either work within or part of site support organisations. And we're going to be discussing with them what questions do we need to ask, what language do we need to ask, how can that then inform surveys and then some more personal interviews, go-along interviews. We're going to try some swim-along interviews as well. So what we intend to do with all of this information, well, initially, with lots of volunteering work that's been going on, we've focused, it's found that actually a lot of the focus is on just being able to get to the environment that you want to go to, that particular blue space. Once you're there, you know, you're equal, you're the same as everybody else. How many people will get into the water and shut their eyes? It's not about what you can see, it's about having that embodied experience. So it's super important to be able to focus on the accessibility and the well-being. We're going to look at producing a national map. Ironically, this is actually of the sewage around the coast. But as an example, we want to be able to show the areas where people with visual impairments can actually access those environments. We're going to do that through national surveys that are going to go out. We're going to look at their own personal identity in terms of their ages and their backgrounds, etc., and what may be going on in their life at the time. And then we can correctly inform why is that particular environment working? Why is that accessible? What makes it accessible? What areas aren't accessible? And hopefully then we can identify all these barriers and facilitators as well that really help and support people getting into these blue spaces for their well-being. Hopefully then we can make these blue space environments more inclusive and then help with the social transformation, not just with social inclusion, but also with environmental stewardship through place attachments and your sense of well-being. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Sadie. And we are Amy and Emma and Jen, I'm Jen, from LLB Inclusive Employment, which we set up primarily to try and work out what is going on with access to work and help support people access to work, and also make sure that they have good training and good facilities to help support disabled staff and in the workplace, particularly in academia. My own experience of access to work is, although I'm been working around ableism and disability in academia for many, many years, I only heard of it a couple of years ago. And from the point of hearing about access to work to actually putting in my own application took over a year. And that was a lot to do with the fact of having to recognise and come to terms with the fact that this might be something that could help me, but also dealing with the kind of emotional work of making sure that that didn't make me less able to do my job or incompetent as an academic because that I needed to have access to work. It was really quite emotional and quite difficult journey. Then when I got the access to work claim awarded, which took quite a while because there's a quite long waiting list. They began this whole process of dealing with finance and dealing with university systems, many of whom didn't know how to deal with access to work, weren't able to like claim back for things or advise. I was bought software that the university already had a license to, which kind of wasted money. And one of the things around access to work that we found is that this isn't just specific to me or specific to the university that I'm based in, but actually this is something that happens an awful lot. I'm going to try and move the slides on. So basically, there's an awful lot of money wasted. And this is from the university point of view, where they've got people who could be supported to do their jobs more efficiently, more productivity. They're not able to be more productive. They're not having to take time off sick, but they're also able to work at a speed that is better because they're supported properly. But also on the basis that if you don't process access to work claims properly and reclaim things, then literally that money is completely lost. And I think at this point I hand over to Emma.
Hello, I was just sending you a message to say that actually we can't see the slides. Or can anyone else see the slides? Or can you? Just me then. It's personal. Okay, well, I don't need to see them, so it's fine. So anyway, access to work, it's a great scheme and it can help a lot of people, but it's really complicated. So as Jen hinted, all three of us have a lot of experience in the world of marginalisation and disabilities and what have you, but we didn't really know what access to work really was and how to access it, or even what you can access via, sort of via the scheme. So we're here to try and sort that out. And what we've discovered in the meantime is that universities and companies don't have any kind of overarching guidance or governance about how they run the systems, which means they lose money, but also the people who are actually receiving the access to work are having extra burdens put on them because they're being required to try and work out how to make the system work and then educate the their employers around them. But also there are other things happening, like there's a burden on them to maybe disclose to managers when they don't want to or don't feel they should have to, and then also for the managers to maybe try and understand more about such a huge range of disabilities than realistically they could, and so we can sort of step in and be the intermediary. Without seeing the slides, I can't quite remember what else comes next. But I think that's it.
I think so. I think we hand over to Amy now.
Yeah. Hi everybody. Thank you for your time today. So what is an example of the sorts of things that we can do? As Emma and Jennifer have both said, we can help individuals and we can also help organisations. So here we've got a kind of structure as to the type of work that we do. So we can offer support for new and for existing staff, and that is important because if you are able to apply for access to work knowing that you have a start date, then they expedite your application for new starters to hopefully around 4 to 6 weeks. And that's a vast difference to the current waiting time of if you're applying as an existing member of staff, which is, I think, sitting at around 26 weeks at the moment. So something that good employers can do is be very aware of that and make sure that if they do have new starters who are disclosing to them that the access to work programme could be suitable, then we can come in immediately and make sure that transition is as streamlined as it's possible to make it. So this will include things like supporting on the application, assessment, equipment support and renewal, and that's important because you do need to renew the award every couple of years. It depends on how an individual has been awarded, but obviously many busy professionals have many other things that they are trying to navigate, and we're able to alleviate the burden of administration and of a lot of the emotional burden that can go with it as well, which makes things much more efficient. And fitting into that, we can offer workplace strategy coaching, and we can support with the mental health support aspect of the access to work claim as well. So we can provide training, we can provide induction, provision of support workers. That's particularly important because we have seen on multiple occasions, and we've experienced it personally as well, where as a high-level professional in a very demanding role, finding appropriate support from somebody who has the adequate skills and expertise to be able to support you properly is fundamental, because there can always be a risk that you end up as a disabled person both doing your own job and having to teach somebody else how to support you. So we take that burden away, and we work from a positive reinforcement model, not a deficit model, as to how people can come to us with particular skills, and we can match them to others who have skills that they need to be supported with, so that it's a win-win situation. It also means that we can provide people who are giving the support as support workers a feeling that what they do is important, that they can progress, that they can become experts in what they do, and that's very important as well. So we can provide disability awareness training in a bespoke way, and again, that's essential because all disabilities are not made equal. Individuals and workplaces have very different demands and needs, and it's really important that that kind of training is not generic, because actually I know that I've sat in training that it's almost so generic it becomes almost weaponized and offensive. And so what we do is the absolute counter to that. So next slide, please, Jen. Okay, and I think this is where I hand back over here? I can talk us through this. So we've got two pathways we can take. So one is engaging us to set up simple and clear policies at an organisational level, so that we can then support organisations to be able to then implement things and operate them themselves in an autonomous way, to make them as an overall organisation in control of that process. Alternatively, they can engage us to work with them and connect with them at various points of the access to work life cycle, so that they're able to essentially commission us to take on that administrative oversight of that particular aspect of the requirement, and they can be safe in the knowledge that they're letting people who are real experts undertake that work. Next slide, Jen. I think that's when I do hand back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I should also say that we do support individuals, and again, we can either support people through the whole process, or you can just engage us to do the application, or stage by stage as you go through the access to work life cycle. Okay, so why us? Why go through us? I think primarily we champion inclusive workplace environments. We are completely and utterly dedicated to and passionate about what we do. We are credible and internationally recognised academics and researchers. This is our field. And I think, Amy, you hit the nail on the head when you said that it might be that you have to educate people. And I think if you're disabled, the last thing that you need to do is to have to educate people about your disability and how best to support you. You know, you might want to educate them about your field, about your research, about your specialism, but this isn't necessarily your specialism. Just because you are an academic and brilliant at what you do, it doesn't mean that you are then able to educate or provide training around your disability. And also, it's a huge emotional burden, which takes away time from doing your actual job. We're unique in the sector because we can support the whole access to work life cycle, as we said, from application through to provision of equipment, training, coaching, mental health needs. We are qualified, we are able to do everything. We are academic EDI and inclusivity experts. We don't just look at disability, we look at things intersectionally, because you can't separate out one thing from another. As Emma said at the beginning, we've got lived experiences of disability, both as employers and employees. We've been through this ourselves. And we offer bespoke EDI and accessibility consultation, research, coaching, counselling and training. I think we've probably all been through courses which have been death by PowerPoint. I think one that was organised for my access to work training was, I didn't go, I gave up my place to someone else. It was on neurodivergence in the workplace, and it was 96 slides for, was it an hour and a half or 2 hours? I can't remember, Emma, I know you went to it.
3 hours.
3-hour training, 96 slides. I can promise you, if you engage inclusive employment to deliver training, you won't get that many slides, and it'll be much more creative and engaging and bespoke. I think that is it in terms of the slides. And we've just got questions. What questions?
I am going to be talking a bit about being a neurodivergent researcher while doing research about neurodivergence, and I really wanted to use this space to have, I suppose, kind of prompt some questions and thoughts and talk about some of the sorts of topics that have already been touched upon today actually in this amazing space, so thank you for organising this, but that we don't really often get to talk about more widely within academia. So just to, let me go forward. There we go. Just to kind of briefly introduce myself, I am Dr. Emma Craddock. I am a senior lecturer in health research at Birmingham City University, and my PhD was in sociology at the University of Nottingham, where I researched activist culture, and particularly looking at anti-austerity activism and women's experiences of activism, cultures and identities, and particularly the sorts of exclusions that exist within those spaces, which also touched upon disability and other intersections. My postdoctoral research has focused on the area of women's health broadly and addressing gendered health inequalities and kind of aiming for improving and increasing social justice. So I've looked at projects around exploring the Women's Health Network in Bradford as a way of engaging with lesser heard voices. I also was a co-investigator on a study exploring period poverty in the UK, and my current research is about women's experiences of late diagnosed autism and ADHD, which is what I'm going to be briefly speaking about today, but I'm not going to be focusing too much on the findings of my research. I can signpost you to papers, and also more than happy to talk about that at length at any point if anyone wants to, but I want to focus more today on the sort of process of being a neurodivergent researcher within academia. I am myself late diagnosed as autistic and ADHD or ADHD, and also dyspraxic, and that like Chantal mentioned at the start, where her research often comes from her personal experiences, that's the case for myself as well, as essentially once I received my diagnosis, I wanted to find out as much as I could about other women's experiences and found that there was really nothing out there. So I just want to start by reading out an excerpt from an article that I wrote that hopefully kind of sets the scene of my experience and kind of moves into talking about this topic. So I walked into the gym and froze. The kettlebells had been moved. Their colours were in a new order. The cardio equipment had been relocated. Nothing seemed how it was. I felt uneasy and exclaimed to my personal trainer, "Everything's wrong. They're meant to be by the window." This wasn't the first time I'd experienced a visceral reaction to changes in my environment. I once became particularly distressed at the sofa being changed in my counsellor's room. I used to torture myself over why I was like this. Why did I get so upset about things that didn't seem to bother others? I was intelligent and a high achiever despite leaving my work until the last minute and operating on a constant roller coaster of high productive peaks and deeply depressed troughs. Yet the many decisions, steps and multitasking involved in cooking a meal could send me over the edge. It didn't make sense. I was constantly exhausted. People exhausted me. Life exhausted me. I now know that I'm dyspraxic, autistic, and ADHD. The depression, anxiety, and panic attacks that I struggled with for years were likely burnout and sensory overload. Reading Sarah Hendricks' Women and Girls with Autism Spectrum Disorder was a light bulb moment. She was describing me, my childhood, and my unique weirdness. I couldn't cope with uncertainty and change, however small. The wrong texture of clothes could drive me to losing my temper. I was an extremely bland and fussy eater. I couldn't stand when things were wrong or unjust. I would get fixated on what others could easily let go of. I spent my whole life trying to figure out what others meant when they spoke because they never said what they meant. I would become obsessed with topics and immerse myself, shutting everything else out. Animals were my biggest allies. I couldn't master gears in a car. I was clumsy. I had overwhelming emotional outbursts that I should have grown out of decades ago. I was always late. I lost everything. If I can't see something, it no longer exists. I have multiple copies of things, having forgotten I've already bought them. I feel like I have multiple monkeys in my brain that all need to be kept busy at the same time in order for me to wrestle control over my mind and body. The racing thoughts never stop. When I discovered I was autistic, I suddenly realised it wasn't just me. There wasn't something deeply wrong with me. I wasn't failing at life and unable to cope with the same mundane tasks others breezed through. I experienced the world in a different way. But this wasn't the whole story. I didn't fit neatly into the autistic box. Learning about ADHD explained why I was ADHD or autistic ADHD. My story is not unique. My research about late diagnosed women's experiences of autism and ADHD shines a light on the rollercoaster lives, misdiagnoses, mental health difficulties, and negative self-perceptions of ADHD women who lived a life undiagnosed. So most people here probably already have a good idea of definitions of autism and ADHD, but I'll very briefly touch on it. So autism or autism, what's known as autism spectrum disorder within the diagnostic manual, but is also called autism spectrum condition, which is less deficit space, is a complex neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by a range of challenges in social interaction, communication, and restricted or repetitive behaviors. It's referred to as a spectrum disorder because individuals can vary widely in presentation, and community definitions center more on what's called spiky profiles of varying impairments that tend to center the sensory challenges of autism and also the kind of lived experience more than diagnostic criteria does, which is renowned for focusing more on external and socially constructed criteria that is a problem for other people, or rather for neurotypical people. ADHD is characterized by persistent patterns of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity that interfere with daily functioning. There are 3 subtypes, including predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive, impulsive, and a combined presentation. Diagnostic criteria, like I said, does vary from community shared definitions and understandings, and it's really important to keep that in mind. I've kind of just included this as a very brief. Here are the official definitions, but there are shared understandings within communities. So autism and ADHD is sometimes referred to as ADHD, and it's estimated that 30 to 80% of individuals with ADHD are also autistic. Assessments and services are conducted in isolation with no consideration of intersection of conditions or wider intersections of sex, gender, ethnicity, class, age, etc. And a combined diagnosis has only been possible since 2013 because previously they were seen to contradict each other within diagnostic criteria. And I've put here red and blue equals purple because I do really feel that, and for my research as well, that having both autism and ADHD, or being autistic and ADHD, is a distinct experience in itself that isn't just the same as kind of the sum of its parts. There are sex biases in terms of diagnosis. So male, it's been perceived to be male conditions with a higher likelihood of diagnosis in males because of this. Also, the diagnostic criteria exhibits male bias in terms of presentation. There are lots of gender elements in relation to masking behaviours, and others have written about that, and I've written a bit about it as well. But in short, increasing number of women are now gaining awareness and actively pursuing and receiving diagnoses of both conditions. So my research really focused on wanting to understand more about what late diagnosed women's experiences of both autism and ADHD were. We're in the infancy of research exploring women's adulthood diagnoses of autism, and there's even less out there about women's adulthood diagnoses of ADHD. There's an absence of research that considers this experience of both, or of like the purple, the mix of the red and the blue. And my research began to explore that. And what I really wanted to do was make sure, and I resonate with people's comments around issues of ethics, because I initially wanted to do this using data collection via WhatsApp, but I wasn't allowed to, so I ended up doing email interviews, and doing that was really useful for my participants, and they said that they were able to much more I'm demonstrating this right now, they were able to communicate in writing much better than they could verbally, and feel more confident and comfortable doing so. so that kind of links to sort of questions that I've started thinking about in terms of what it's like being a neurodivergent researcher, but also the way that research itself can be seen to be quite neuronormative, and the sort of things that we expect and think about as what makes good research. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that and kind of open this up for thinking and discussing. So there is some literature out there about being an autistic academic, which highlights some of the challenges and strengths. And along this line of kind of nothing about us without us, the importance of autistic researchers doing research in that area and not being studied ourselves. Some of the kind of, in a nutshell, some of the challenges that I face, which I don't think are spoken about enough, and which produce kind of sometimes can be invisible barriers, are navigating relationships and networking, which is a massive part and important for advancing career and doing research and etc. Knowing when to speak and how to speak, so sometimes I can be left out of conversations or come across in the wrong way. Processing information in different ways. Sorry, it keeps jumping forward. Sensory overload, having different working patterns that I've touched on. Also massive struggles with long-term strategic planning and organising, which are again things that are really important in terms of progressing. I have a need for structure and clarity. Something that Chantel touched upon earlier that I thought was really interesting and that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of my own personal experience as well, is this before and after time and space, where people often think about the energy expended in, say, social interactions or going to work or everyday things, but also there's a lot in terms of the preparation and the recovery from that, and also potential for others to misunderstand and incorrectly perceive me. So this has led to me thinking more about the sort of ableism of academia, particularly in terms of the expectations for career progression and what sort of quality research supposedly looks like. So things like, if you read any research textbooks, you're always there's a hierarchy where face-to-face research is prioritized. Things like maintaining eye contact and building a good rapport in what is typically quite neurotypical ways are seen as what makes a good researcher. Feminist, smaller scale qualitative research is still not prioritized or valued the same that large scale quantitative research is. And I'm starting to kind of think about how these sorts of implicit rules and sort of field of academia is neuronormative. Similarly, things with career progression, the way that you have to perform and all of the sort of implicit rules and expectations that are there are things that I really find as a barrier, and that I imagine a lot of other neurodivergent individuals find as barriers. And we've touched upon that today, thinking about dyslexia as well, and the way that people can interpret what you're presenting. I think the way that I work can be quite different. I think of myself as a bit of an academic magpie, in that I typically research topics that I find interesting, and I know the sort of traditional trajectory for a career is to kind of do a top PhD about something and then continue with that for forever. Whereas I have got strands that run throughout that are I suppose that stay without, but I tend to move around a lot more and get attracted by things that are currently relevant or interesting to me or glittery, and then want to move on to something else. And that can be quite hard to package that up in a way that looks like I've got this well thought out linear career journey and progress, which I've tried to kind of illustrate with this sort of ladder, climbing this ladder of progress and success and what that looks like within academia. Yeah, I don't know how much time I've been talking for. That's another thing that I struggle with is knowing time and limits, but I just thought this was something that I wanted to just really talk about and touch upon in terms of thinking about ourselves as researchers who are maybe neurodivergent or disabled in other ways, and how that can impact, and also not just researchers but academics and that wider context of academia, and how there can be these invisible barriers there. So thank you for listening. And Hi
everyone, I'm Pete Stevens. I'm doing a Master's in Sustainable Design, and it just really made me chuckle actually just listening to Emma there about saying that you're sort of caught up with things that are glittery like a magpie. So I'm a real experimental, creative researcher, and I find that really fits me very well. I have dyslexia and auditory processing, and I'm a very visual learner. I talk about the disparity lens of disability because it's the differences within the disability that I find so interesting, and other people have spoken as well about how that can show up differently, and how our disabilities are all very different. Interesting, I've used a camera lens for my first slide, and what happened to me was I had an industrial accident 19 years ago where I damaged the lower half of my body, my lower back and my pelvis, which created extreme levels of pain, which now is chronic pain, and mobility issues. Because I had an industrial accident, not only did I have to go through and prove myself to clinicians on a weekly basis, I was also surveillance. So this is why the camera lens is really quite sort of prevalent for my work. That's something we don't really talk about because there's quite a lot of shame around that, where we have to prove ourselves. I had a court hearing as well, which I did win in the end, but the trauma of going through that, of proving yourself through clinicians and through, so that was NHS clinicians, and then also I would be seeing private clinicians and they wouldn't talk to each other. I had lots and lots of healthcare notes. I'd had lots of scans that proved the damage that I'd had, and yet I still had to fight a court case, which was really traumatic and took probably the length of about 5 years fighting. So the disparities within disability are not just in the differences within the disabilities, but the differences in the everyday, the day and the night as well, and they can show up in all different ways. I have a lot of fatigue, and many times I've been told that I don't actually look disabled, which I did struggle with probably recognising my disability. I also have a, which is really interesting, I have a label of 30% disabled that I carry with me, and sometimes I refer to that, or sometimes I just disregard that. For me, understanding that is quite complex, because disability never really sat with me because it was so complex and multi-layered that I couldn't quite understand it. It was only going through probably about 5 years before I could go through a pain management program that I learned to understand what disability and what chronic pain really did to your body. I also, my first interaction with a GP, I was given medication, and I was prescribed pregabalin. Now, pregabalin, I think I was prescribed that in 2005, and I was on that drug for about 8 years with no interventions and no changes. Now, in 1st of April 2019, pregabalin was classified as a Class C drug in the sense of like heroin. I did have a prescribed pain medication addiction. I realised that was problematic when I would have my red wine with my tablets because I couldn't get quite enough hit to cover the pain. But I think there's a lot of shame around talking about medication addiction, especially prescribed medication addiction. I know there's lots of research into that now. The National Institute for Health, NICE, now released a statement that actually they now recognise that prescribed medication doesn't help chronic pain sufferers. So there will be a really big fallout of that at the moment. The reason I talk about healthcare a lot is because through my pain management programs, I went back in as a speaker and I set up a support group supporting people within the community. And I spoke at Brighton Hospital to clinicians, and that was really invaluable. But actually, my role within research is I'm a product maker, I'm a welder, I work with mild steel, but also now this creative practice really suits me because I look at alternative ways for otherwise pain care. I'm a real advocate for pain care within community and supporting people within their own homes and their community and within the everyday. So chronic pain affects between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population in the UK, so that equates to 28 million adults. Globally, chronic pain affects 20% of the adults. 10% are newly diagnosed every year, and chronic pain is more common in women, about 38%, than in men, which is 30%. This is from the NHS. So my first sort of interest probably in large-scale metalwork was making the invisible visible. So this is an installation I made that's metal, that's mild steel and resin, and these are, so this is immersive as well. So a person would sit, there's a little seat between within this installation, and you would wear ear defenders. And what I was trying to show people was actually that brain fog, that when you're in chronic pain and have huge fatigue, you're within the room. So this was a busy room, this was an installation, there was a show going on, but you're actually removed from people. You can't hear what people are saying, even though you can see they're talking to you. You can't comprehend the language or what they're asking you or talking about. You feel removed. So these are pain pods that get in the way of my thought processes. These were both 4 metre installations. This was a cage that you walked in, and this was the cage that I tried to describe was the chronic pain within inside, was the internal suffering that people couldn't recognise or couldn't see. And this was the pain just raining down on me that would then distort my views and my understanding of the world. And it became really disconnecting, which is why I think community work is so important to me now. I use myself due to ethics, which is really interesting. We've all talked about this today, but due to just the Masters of 1 year course, and there's quite a quick time frame, but I use myself as a case study, which is really interesting. So I 3D printed myself, and I've taken a 3D picture of myself and then rendered that onto the 3D print of myself. It's interesting as a third agent. So when you go through pain management programs, you have a third agent. So you have a psychologist, a pain mentor, and a physiotherapist. And as a third agent, so that's outside of you, they enable you to look at yourself differently, to look at your mobility, to look at how you interact with the world, to question what you find difficult within your everyday. I remember talking about I struggled to make a roast dinner, and that was kind of my benchmark. So I learned ways actually to do that differently, and I would then do each part of the roast dinner. It would take me all day to make it, but the achievement I got at the end of that was really amazing. And I learned also about perching stool. So I would sit and peel the carrots, which some people would just take as a given that they can do that. And for me, that was a real milestone. So I use myself. I also believe that looking at ourselves, and if we can understand ourselves, then we can move beyond self and we can help others. But I think we have to come from a place of knowing ourselves and the difficulties that we face to be able to understand others better. Uncertainty is technology for disruption, and to reconceptualise uncertainty as generative and inevitable rather than seeing it as threatening. I think what we do within society is that we would rather hold on to the trauma and the difficulties because they're familiar to us. We recognise ourselves within that, and it's quite difficult to move beyond that. But it's recognising the technologies that I use is a privileged position to be within the university, so which is why I use this creative play to understand myself better, so that I can able to support others better. But I think uncertainty, I'm quite comfortable with uncertainty, because I think when you live with chronic pain, that becomes very uncertain each day. So another thing that my experimental practice is in motion caption, so you'll recognise that within films. So the reason that we can recognise almost ourselves within Planet of the Apes and Avatar and Gollum is because they use motion caption. They take human movements so that we can recognise that that's familiar to us again. So it's another kind of understanding of the world. So I put myself into this motion caption and looked at myself again, my mobility. I struggled to walk when I had my accident, so I had to learn how to walk better, how to walk easier. I was walking, I didn't realise that after my accident I was walking from my knees, and that created huge problems for my pelvis, which was already dislocated. So it was learning those physical aspects of the human body, which we don't really understand unless we have that as a career. The reason I really look at Gordon Pask and conversation theory, and Chantal and I do podcasts where we open conversation about what we're researching, but also how we share this knowledge. And this is really important when you come to be within healthcare, when as a patient you're speaking to clinicians, and how we share that knowledge. And Abby was mentioning about the patient perhaps being the expert as well, and we're not seen as the expert with all our lived experience, but it's starting to be recognised now. But even 19 years after my accident, I still support people with chronic pain, and they still say the same problems that I faced 19 years ago. So I think there's something to really understand here how we share this knowledge, and to be open and responsive to that. And Gordon Pask looks into how these information loops on a cybernetic framework and how this information can move around and be understood with different people and conversations. The other experimental work that I'm just doing at the moment, which was really insightful, I'm usually I have quite a lot of critiques about what I'm using this technology for. I'm from a design discipline. I'm not a technologist, but actually I'm moving into the area just because it enables me to be able to step outside my own zone, my own self, and be able to see how I respond to situations. So working with heavy engineering and an engineering technician at Brighton University, and that's not part of my course, but it's something I just literally walked into the door one day and asked if somebody could help me with motion caption. We've now progressed, so what I'm wearing here, you can't quite see, but I have brainwave monitoring equipment on that's recording my brain activity with a VR, with a hospital simulation. And what came out of this research was the amount of brain activity that I was having within this simulation. Now, when I go into any hospital setting, I become quite anxious, and it's if I've been continuously into that setting, I'm straight back into the trauma. And that's quite difficult to remove myself from that traumatic experience. But what happened here was, after I'd been around this simulation, and you can't quite see it, but with the VR, it's a 360 room. And it's a very simplified hospital setting. But what that does is something that's just an initial research at the moment. But after I'd been through this, and it was literally a few minutes, my descriptive word was, I don't feel safe. And I wouldn't have come to that sort of insight, knowledge or understanding if I hadn't have done this experimental research. And this works for me really well because I'm on the edges of care. I'm looking at an otherwise pain management care community, because we've talked about it, but healthcare is really struggling at the moment to provide this, and chronic pain doesn't actually really fit within the the healthcare system narratives, because there's not enough understanding about it, and because it's so complex, it's so multi-layered, it's so dependent on personality and society, and privilege and background, and economics. But what happened here was when I spoke about the safe, that actually landed with me, and that's exactly how I felt. So that's something I'm exploring, and how I can bring that now within community. Work now is developing that I leave notes on benches for people to find. That's not something that I will gain research feedback from, but it's actually the sense of giving something back and maybe making that difference within the community. Another thing I'm looking at is audio time capsules. So when we're going through pain management, or we might have chronic pain, the initial stages of that, we record our journey, and it's just for ourselves. There's research now that actually it's not always beneficial to share it within a group. We need to be able to share it with ourselves first. And so it's creating this time capsule that we can maybe listen back to 6 months, 2 years time, and see the differences. And also that has implications, ethical implications as well, if that may not, that may become a legacy, or an educational tool for other people to learn from.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to apologise in advance to everybody for my voice, which may be somewhat unreliable. And I'm also just going to let you know I'm speaking to notes, because as one of those other late diagnosed ADHD people, I have no sense of time, no concept of time, so I need to inhibit my tendency to go off on tangents. So, all right, there we go. Kia ora tātou no inia hoki oku tūpuna I whānau mai I Ingarangi, kei tamaki makaurau e hoe noho ana, ko Emma Sedera, tōku ingoa no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm Emma Sedera, I'm Associate Dean for Equity and Diversity and a Senior Teaching Fellow from the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences
at Waipapa Taimatoro, the University of Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I am delighted to be part of this symposium. Did that work? Yes, it did. Excellent. To talk a little bit about some of the questions and practices that I'm engaging with the aim of decolonising my academic work, teaching disability studies to medical students and undertaking research with disabled and other marginalised participants. So, in terms of my positionality, in speaking with you here today, you heard at the beginning I gave you my pepeha, and that's a little explanation of what a pepeha is in Māori culture. I should note that obviously I'm going to be speaking about Māori culture, my understanding of it, because Aotearoa, New Zealand is a bicultural nation, and so it's really important for me, for all of those of us who are living and working in these lands and in these spaces, to have a good grasp of Te Ao Māori. So I gave to you my pepeha at the beginning, which explains that I am mixed race, I am from India, and I'm from England, and Te Maki Makaurau, Auckland is now my home. And so, as I mentioned, I'm a disabled woman of colour living and working in the settler state known as New Zealand in the rest of the world, where I hold Tauiwi status. Tauiwi, that is non-Māori, non-Indigenous status, and I acknowledge my relationship as a treaty partner to tangata whenua, that is the people of that land. And as I say, I want to acknowledge up front that I am not an Indigenous person, I'm not Indigenous to Aotearoa, to the Pacific. I am therefore still learning and seeking to educate myself in what colonisation has meant and continues to mean for tangata whenua. And so what I'll discuss with you today in relationship to disability and indigeneity represents my current best understanding and is founded on my engagement with Indigenous scholars and their work. But any errors or misunderstandings are entirely mine to own and to correct. And I'm committed to doing that work to improve my knowledge and to thus be a better ally and activist. So in stating this positionality that I hold up front, I do note that it's not a neutral act. There are power dynamics at play in discussing positionality, identity and relationality, even for those of us within already marginalised groups such as disabled people, as identities are of course experienced intersectionally, and thus the risks to those with racialised and minoritized identities, including Indigenous and Global South people, are heightened. And I note this particularly as relationality praxis is, I contend, a vital part of challenging current hegemonic norms and establishing new, depathologized and decolonized sites of power in the academy and beyond. So throughout this, excuse me, keep going. Throughout this keynote talk, I will of course use the term disability and disabled, usually in an identity-first format, as that's what resonates for me, but I acknowledge others may have different preferences, and my language use is not intended to feel exclusionary. So my use of the term disabled is intended to encompass anyone who experiences impairment, chronic illness, neurodivergence, mental ill health, and who is disabled by those experiences. So if we look at who this then might include in the context of where I live and work now, according to the June 2022 report from Stats NZ, which is our national statistics agency, the rates of tangata whaikaha, which is people with disabilities, are slightly higher, as you can see, amongst Māori people and Pacifica people. So 24% of the overall New Zealand population identifies as disabled, so that's around 1.2 million people. But for the Indigenous population, that is actually slightly higher at 26%. However, when those numbers are adjusted for the population age structure, the prevalence of tangata whaikaha Māori is around 32%, so fairly significantly higher. And despite having these higher rates of health-related impairment, 39% of tangata whaikaha, that's Māori disabled people and Pacific disabled people, report having an unmet health need, so that's 1.4 times higher than non-Māori. And 1 in 4 tangata whaikaha Māori report having insufficient income to meet their daily needs and experience inequities in accessing funding for equipment and care. So these numbers crudely, but I think effectively, demonstrate the effects of colonisation on Indigenous populations, for whom the already disadvantaging effects of experiencing disability that all disabled people experience are compounded by colonisation. So thinking about who this includes and who is disabled, I want to acknowledge that practices of colonisation do result, as I've mentioned, in increased levels of poor health and impairment for Indigenous peoples, leading often to increased experiences of disability in these populations, including in Aotearoa. And there's work done in Indigenous populations around the world, and this same finding comes up in Canada and in Mexico and in all sorts of places. However, studies have noted that many Indigenous communities may actually reject outright identification with the term and idea of disability, as this is not a conceptual definition that is meaningful for them, and instead feels like an external imposition, a recolonisation of sorts. And I've put some quotes here on the screen, which speak to this kind of recolonisation that can be perceived amongst Indigenous populations when contending with the label of disability. Excuse me, and of course I will share these slides afterwards, because I note that there are things that you may want to read and to think about in depth. And this sense of recolonisation can be exacerbated by interactions with medical professionals. And we've talked a little bit amongst ourselves already today about some of the issues with interacting with medical professionals who have perhaps limited understanding or knowledge of disability. And this is, of course, exacerbated by medical professionals who are non-Indigenous and who have often limited insight into A, the social and cultural experience of disability beyond impairment, and B, cultural competence around Indigenous constructions of impairment and disability. And I will note that these next two slides probably will just merely repeat things that you already know, but in reflecting on the theme of this symposium, we're invited to consider how the role that models play in academic and enacted constructions of disability, and to determine how and why we might move beyond them. So to that end, I just wanted to very briefly first note the main features of the dominant models, although, as I said, I'm sure we're all painfully familiar with them already. So, of course, the medical model of disability is the dominant model in medicine and healthcare, as it has been for a number of decades. And of course, it regards disability as an individual function and a function of impairment. And the goal of treatment is, of course, to fix or to cure disability, to bring disabled bodies as close as possible to the normate body, if we use Rosemary Garland Thompson's framing. So by way of challenging the individualistic and curative aspects of the medical model, what became known as the social model of disability was developed. And of course, in this model, disability is not an attribute of an individual, but rather a complex collection of conditions, many of which are created by the social environment. Hence, the management of the problem requires social action and is the collective responsibility of society at large to make the environmental modifications necessary for the full participation of people with disabilities in all areas of social life. And this environment, of course, includes social, cultural, economic factors, as well as the built environment. However, of course, as many disability scholars, including Shakespeare and Watson and various others since then, have argued, in practice, the distinction between impairment and disability can be unclear, especially as impairment can cause disability, and indeed disability can exacerbate an impairment. So disregarding or delegitimizing the notion of impairment can be problematic in itself. So models are, as I've just been discussing, by their very nature somewhat exclusive. If you invoke the medical model only, you disregard the socially, politically, economically, culturally constructed facets of what living life with impairment in disabling context constitutes. If you invoke only the social model, then you exclude folk for whom impairment is conceptually and actually dominant and for whom treatment is desired. So of course there have been many efforts to problematise this and develop models which sit more inclusively. For example, the biopsychosocial model developed by Engel in 1977, which attempted to integrate biological and social influences on disability together with psychological factors. Disability studies is of course now replete with multiple alternative models of disability. However, I want to note that still most of these models have been and are being developed in the global north. They therefore speak to an experience and an understanding of disability which is not in any way universal and which is therefore culturally unsafe and itself perpetuates inequity. There are also attempts by some Indigenous disability scholars to create frameworks that reflect their positionalities and understandings from a culturally safe perspective, such as Hickey and Wilson's 2017 Whānau Hawa alternative Indigenous approach, and I've alluded to that in the descriptor on the screen there. So, thinking about then, that's the sort of the place that we are with models, but if we think about moving beyond the models, you know, some of the criticism that I've described around using models, models are and can be norming and reductive, and disability, you know, we, us, our lives, our experiences, our relationships to objects, places, processes and structures are messy and complex and fluctuating and plastic. So some of the existing criticism of disability models emerging from disability scholars actually accord specifically with ways in which these models can be read as colonial products, which emphasise impairment and individuality and disregard or downplay perceptions of natural variation and holistic collectivist identities. Further, models of disability developed in the global north, as I've referenced, explicitly reflect Western notions, ideals and relationships to disability and impairment, which exclude or do not represent Indigenous experiences. These models position disability as largely individualistic and personal experiences, and this individualism sits at odds with many Indigenous ways of knowing and experiencing disability, which are holistic, collective and relational. In Māori cultural history, it's been argued that disability conceptually did not exist prior to colonisation. Those with what might be described by mainstream disability terminology as impairments were not othered or subject to deficit framing, but were regarded as simply part of the natural diversity of humanity and were positioned within their iwi or tribe and hapu or clan groups within the tribe, within the iwi, according to this understanding. So there is no specific word in Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, to describe disability, although, as I've used, the modern adopted phrase now is tangata whaikaha, which means people who are determined to do well. And we can think about what the meanings of that might be anon. So in addition to being unrepresented in most of the mainstream narratives of disability that emerge from the models which have dominated disability studies as a discipline, there is within them an inherent assumption of othering which many Māori disability scholars and tangata whaikaha reject. Instead, their cultural norms include and feature impairment as part of natural diversity, and often disability is accorded high status, including amongst many of the creation gods. And I've noted some on this slide here. So as you can see, Mahuika, the goddess of fire, was blind, was depicted as blind. Maui, the demigod of Polynesian stories, who features very heavily in Maori and Pacifica creation narratives, is depicted as having club feet, and Taifira Matea, the god of the winds, who is depicted in this image here, in this sculpture, was depicted as blind, portrayed as blind, and you can see that from this depiction here. So then, thinking about more inclusive representations, and if we think about these indigenous concepts of disability that I've been talking about, where impairment is perceived as difference primarily in the context of natural diversity, an ontology of uniqueness rather than a framing as specifically as impairment. These Māori and Pacific conceptualizations of identity are multifaceted and multi-temporal, with connection to ancestors, to place, to space and to time as central, and not according to Western hermeneutic notions of linear time and constructions of identity formation. So is claiming disability as an identity thus excluding of Indigenous people who experience impairment as part of this natural diversity, but who therefore do not consider themselves as disabled? In discussing the work of Shakespeare and Watson around disability identity formation and the claiming, reclaiming of labels, Rivers Velarde notes that in this sense, it is easy to see that what has emerged as a political strategy for the liberation of disabled persons in the global north has arguably widened the divide between the north and the south, thereby reinforcing oppressive ideologies. So if then these dominant models of disability are open to criticism from a range of disability scholars and are also potentially actively recolonising disabled Indigenous people, what can I do as scholars of disability to decolonise our work at the same time as we seek to depathologise disability and centre anti-ableism? And here I think it's really important to explicitly note that just being anti-ableist doesn't absolve you from being complicit in other forms of discrimination. And so that's a constant place of work for us all, I think. So this is where I'm coming to it from. So one solution, one possible area, the site of action is in cripping our universe, our university, cripping our teaching, our learning and research spaces. So if we think about compulsory able-bodiedness as producing disability in the way that compulsory heteronormativity produces queerness, then the corollary is that compulsory settler values produces subalternity in Gramscian terms. So for Robert McClure, the response to compulsory able-bodiedness is in using crip theory to provide materialist critique of these practices. In considering how I can strive to decolonise my teaching, my research, my activism within the academy, I see the value in cripping as offering an opportunity to create an anti-ableist and anti-colonialist paradigm. But this cripping has to be enacted in ways that are truly mindful of coloniser assumptions and which consciously seek to destabilise these. So for example, in my teaching, and as I mentioned, I teach stage 3 medical students, small subsections of them. I unfortunately don't get to teach all of New Zealand's medical students disability studies. Would that I were, and it's part of my end goal of global domination, believe me. But I teach disability studies, and I teach about models of disability as part of that teaching. But I encourage my students to critique these as instruments emerging from global north positions and engaging with contested experiences of impairment and disability. I make space in the classroom for experts with lived experience of disability and indigeneity, and I welcome them to show up however they choose to and interact with students however is most meaningful for the shared collective korero or conversation. In another example, I regard inflexible deadlines as inherently ableist and also founded on assumptions that every student enjoys privilege in their living circumstances and holds high academic cultural capital. These too are colonialist assumptions that do not consider, let alone prioritise, the lived experiences of many Māori and Pacific students who may well be living within multi-generational homes, have caring and working responsibilities, and need to prioritise these factors over their ability to meet a particular assessment deadline. My response to this is to crip my deadlines as much as I am able to. That is, to invite my students to meet the due dates as they can, according to the needs they have and the expectations they encounter, in conversation with me, in order that they are able to bring their authentic selves to the learning spaces. My teaching environment is one which I have a significant level of control over. The research space, however, is somewhat different, and we have again been talking together about the vagaries of ethics and all sorts of things today, and I think I'm just, leaning onto that as well. But how do we crip research spaces to decenter global north/western normative expectations and to reclaim space for crip concepts such as non-compliance and decomposition, when the expectations, as we have just recently heard, are inherently around orderliness and normative modes of expression, let alone research areas and methodologies that are familiar to reviewers? So here, enacting and engaging with Indigenous qualitative methodologies, including kaupapa Māori research and Talanoa, enacts decolonisation alongside anti-ableism, as these research approaches prioritise relationality and values such as whanaungatanga, which is kinship and connection, and manaakitanga, which is hospitality and generosity. However, as relational and interpersonal methodologies, they also allow space for flexibility and responsiveness to accessibility needs, including holding data collection activities at places of the participants' choosing, perhaps swim-along research, as Sadie was describing, and where they feel supported and comfortable, inviting whānau or extended family to attend and contribute or offer support, and being open to flexible durations akin to crip time. I am able to control that space and the ways in which I can conduct research to a certain extent. I am not, however, able to control the conditions under which I access funding for research, and I will not pretend that I have not encountered issues with funding bodies unfamiliar with Indigenous methodologies or, conversely, unprepared to accept their use in research teams who are not exclusively Indigenous. However, although of course the fundamental principle of nothing about us without us means that we must ensure that we do not remove opportunities from Indigenous and BIPOC researchers, those whose underrepresented voices and perspectives must be prioritised, the more of us who are able to reconsider the relatively small pool of Western-centric research approaches that are typically used and integrate, the more we're able to challenge these methodological hegemonies, and the more we're able to decolonise and depathologise our research approaches. But having comprehensively problematised disability models, where models can be useful is in helping those who have not yet begun to challenge received ideas about disability, let alone to engage critically with those meanings to approach this. So I want to talk a little bit about where I do see a value for models. So for example, again in my teaching, aside from the saturation of social and cultural messages and images around impairment and disability that my students, these medical students, have received in their lives, they've also internalised at least 3 years of medical training in which disability is, where it is even mentioned at all, positioned explicitly according to the medical model, explicitly and repeatedly, I should note. So it is, disability it is, we are something to be treated, fixed and cured. So for these students, this becomes axiomatic. The body is a series of systems and processes, and the optimal operation of these systems is, of course, the goal of medicine. Right? Right? So when they arrive in my classroom and I begin to tell them about how disabled is not a bad word, about how impairment and illness are part of the infinite variability of the human body-mind, how disability is political, how the normate body is geographically, temporally, culturally and historically contingent, and how treatment and cure are not the only lenses through which to view disability, they struggle to reframe their core fundamental beliefs. So being able to present them with models to unpack and compare and to help them critique those hermeneutic understandings to become reflexive and critical is a valuable tool in my teaching arsenal. Of course, as I mentioned, we problematize these models once they've been able to use them to shift how they think about disability initially, including acknowledging the explicit Western perspectives and their production in these contexts. And supporting this shift is important, particularly in future medical professionals, to encourage doctors to not just understand how prevailing medicalised ontologies of disability harm disabled people and the role of their profession in perpetuating that harm, but also to become active change makers in challenging that and serving their patients in more anti-ableist and culturally competent ways is essential. That is what real allyship and socially just allyship means. So to wrap up a little bit, I put here final thoughts, but I want to note that this is evolving thinking and working, and this is an ongoing process. And so these are not actually my final thoughts on the matter at all. But I want to offer these two kind of key points for us to think, to discuss, and to potentially to collaborate on. These two key practices that I'm currently wrestling with in engaging with teaching and research as a disabled Tawiwi academic working in colonised contexts and wishing to work against that are, firstly, positionality is foundational. If we do not reckon with ourselves and who we are as we come to these spaces, we risk reinforcing those colonialist mindsets, even as we strive against ableism. Being anti-ableist, as I mentioned, is not enough. Weaving together these decolonising and cripping practices as part of the same conscious effort in teaching, research, and indeed service is one way in which we may be able to challenge some of these uninclusive spaces, moving disability research and teaching towards more inclusive and socially just outcomes. And I want to close by posing a question for us to think about, discuss, and share our thoughts on, finding a response to. What can we do individually and collectively? How are we able to weave decolonisation and depathologization practices into our work on disability and in our enactment of our positionalities as disabled people, people with disabilities in the academy? Ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you very much.